Hi, so this is a short introduction to Model Runner, an open source data management platform. The idea is that you can design models for your data and then deploy them to the platform and straight away being able to use applications to manage that data. It's a no-code and speech-enabled platform, which means that you don't even have to code anything, you don't even have to type anything, and you should be able to use your voice for everything. It's also an open source platform, it's got an MIT license, and you can find all the code in GitHub. And so there's a bit of an explanation about the platform architecture and some documentation about how to set it up. If you don't want to set it up yourself, or you want to try it first, you can log on to modelrunner.org and click on this link at the top here. If you register, you will get an email with a link. When you click on that link, it will create an account for you. Then you go back to models, and you should be able to log in with your account to the model editor. So it's a web-based graphical model editor, but it's also speech-enabled. So you can just click on speak and describe what you want to do. You should see the results of the Google SpeechRec in the console here at the bottom. So let's give it a try. Please create an application called test. Right, so something's happened. We have an application called test. Create a package called test. So now we have a package, and it's basically a logical grouping of related data types. Create a type called person. So we have our first data type. It also has a main panel, which is where we group the attributes together on the UI. So we can have multiple panels for the same data type. And it also has a default name attribute, which is a string. And it's a standard way, the default way to identify a person in this case. But we can also leverage a name formula, which is interpreted at runtime and can be built upon different attribute values and variables and things like this. Add an integer attribute called age. Add a type called city. Add a type called city. Okay. Create a type called city. Add an attribute called postcode. Add a text attribute called notes. Add a text attribute called notes. Right, sometimes Google doesn't really understand what I'm saying, but that's probably because of my accent. Select person. Add a reference attribute called city and set reference to city. Right. Okay, so we have a bit of a data model happening. We have two data types, and they have there is a relationship between the two, which is just a reference. So the model supports all the UML type of references, including back references, which is not really a UML thing. But so once we have a model like this, we can just deploy it to the platform. I can just click on deploy, or I can just say, please deploy the application. Right, so now the application has been deployed, which means that the model has been saved to the platform and a schema has been created for the data. So now we log out of the editor, and then we can start logging into the application. So in fact, it's always the same application that we're using, but we're just pointing it towards a different model. In this case, we're going to use the test model, but the application itself is already coded, and it's just going to interpret that model at runtime. So once you're logged in, you can see there's the name of the model at the top, the name of the package here, and all the different data types. And you can start using the application, like you would any normal data management application, like create records and things like this, or you can continue using your voice, and you can say things like, please create a city called Melbourne and set notes to the most livable city in the world and set postcode to 3000. Right. So in one sentence, I was able to create a data object and populate 3 different fields. Right. So that's a very, very fluent way of doing this. Let's create another one. Please create a city called Sydney and set notes to the beautiful harbor city and set postcode to 2000. Right, and again, it's working perfectly fine. And and the point is that it supports any kind of data model, right? Sorry. So now we can create some persons. So now if I go, we can also actually query the data, right? So I can say, please give me a list of cities. Get me the city called Melbourne. And what's interesting is that we have the result of the natural language understanding at the bottom here, right? So it's not like a black box thing. I left the login in the screen so you can actually see what's happening. Now we can create some persons. Please create a person called Peter and set city to Melbourne and set age to 20. Cool. You can see that I had to be a bit funny because when I say 220, Google understands 220 as in 220. So I've had to put some kind of logic in there to say that once you're trying to set a numeric variable and it's got starting with 2 and there's no 2 in the sentence, then it's probably because it's 220 as opposed to 220, right? Anyway. Create a person called John and set city to Melbourne and set age to 50. In this case, he didn't get the age at all. Set age to 50. Right. Please create a person called Steve and set age to 20 and set city to Sydney. Right, okay. So again, it's a very fluent way of creating the data. And also we can interact the data. So, and what's interesting in this one is that when I said set the city to Sydney, we had to retrieve a record of a city called Sydney, right? It's not just updating a field, putting Sydney in there. So we have to understand that the reference from a person to a city is you have to locate the city called Sydney and assign it to the person. And again, this works with any kind of a data model, not just this particular one. And then we can, again, interrogate the data. Please get me a list of persons. Get me a list of persons in Melbourne. Get me a list of persons in Melbourne called Peter. Oops, called Peter. Get me a list of persons in Melbourne, age 20. There you go. We can see that Peter is the person in Melbourne, age 20, right? So it's a very easy way also to interrogate the data. You don't have to create an SQL, join or all these types of things. You just actually ask the data, right, in a normal language. But the semantics that the platform understands is only coming from the model, right? So if I say, get me a list of people, we don't know what a people is because it's in the model we only have persons, right? So we can log out and we can go back to the model editor. We can edit our application. And now I'm just going to go to persons and put a concept in there called people, right? To say that, well, a person is kind of related to the concept of people. Right, and I just deploy that. So again, I can say, please deploy, or I just click on deploy. And now if I look back onto the application, again, the application is called test. Right. So if I say, get me a list of people, right? So now it works because we know that the people is related to the concept of, to the entity of person, right? So now this is a very simple example, but you can build much more complicated applications. I've built, order management systems from scratch in an hour basically, and including workflows and leveraging formulas that are imported at runtime and actions that you can put on the GUI actually will show up as a button. And so there's a lot of things you can do with the platform. This was just a very simple introduction, and I hope we can see the value of coming up with an application to manage data just using your voice, in minutes, without having to code anything or type anything, right? So hopefully you find it interesting, and feel free to, leave me a note and tell me what you think. Thank you.